So Mike Winger recently answered a question about whether the effects of ADHD are a sin, and he said a lot of things in response that weren't great. Let's dive right into it.
Number 5, Billows Pillow says, how can I reconcile 1 Corinthians 10:13 after decades of struggle with sloth, bad work ethic, sin at work, praying for forgiveness, but was recently diagnosed ADHD. I now see I can't help it without meds.
Interesting question. If being lazy is considered wrong, can you be blamed for having a condition that makes you less focused and thus less productive at your job? And within the context of Winger's question, at what point does your wrong behavior rise to the level of sin? These are some legitimately tricky questions that expose some cracks in religion's view of behavior. So let's see where Winger goes with this.
Well, let me give you my answer on this. 1 Corinthians 10:13. And my answer is primarily a theological answer, not a medical answer. So if you're looking for medical expertise on ADHD, I don't have it. I'm not going to try to pretend I do. But I do trust the scripture on this topic of temptation.
This is a fascinating qualifier. Mike, of course, wants to make it clear he's not giving out medical advice, which is a responsible thing to do and a good reflex if you want to cover your butt against liability. But he seems to be insinuating that having the theological answer but not the medical one leaves a significant gap in his knowledge on the topic. Right? But this seems strange. I mean, if God has all the answers and has presented them to us in his perfect inerrant word, then wouldn't a sound theological answer on ADHD be a complete answer? Why would we need medicine to explain anything about it at all? In fact, couldn't medicine be seen as encroaching on God's territory by claiming to speak about this topic, especially since it touches on matters of human behavior and possibly sin? And this conundrum isn't purely hypothetical. A lot of Christians see a medical approach to ADHD, or even any clinical approach to psychology, as human pretense at knowing better than God. They see all these questions about psychology, neurology, and mental health as muddying what God has already made clear about sin and righteousness, probably with the purpose of devaluing righteousness and excusing sin. Of course, other Christians do approach these topics more reasonably. Many find ways to reconcile theology and science, seeing them both as tools God has given us. But this always gets a bit tricky, and as we go on, we'll start to see how.
And I do think that there is a cliff that some have walked off when it comes to ADHD and these other issues. I also want to say what I'm about to tell you is not meant to minimize those things. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid. I don't know if it wasn't a very good diagnosis. The doctor asked me like 3 questions. Are you bored in school? Yeah. Do you find the work challenging? No. Do you find that you frequently get distracted and you have a hard time staying focused? Yeah, which is true still today, by the way. And then she goes, and this was when Ritalin just came out, and she's like, at least I think it just came out.
Considering the loose grasp he seems to have on both this story and the topic, I'd say it's a darn good thing he gave that medical disclaimer, because this is starting to sound a lot worse than not medical advice.
And she's like, I'd like to give you a prescription for Ritalin. I think you have ADHD. And I remember my mom looking at me going, what do you think? And I was like in elementary school, and I was smart enough to go, in my head, I thought, I don't think that sounded like a very good diagnosis. She didn't take any tests. There was literally no tests. She just asked me questions. Like, I just find it very difficult.
This is a weird story for Mike to tell here, because it just doesn't seem that relevant to the question at hand. I guess it shows how some people prescribed Ritalin too quickly as a catch-all for challenging students, but, well, we know that. This was widely understood to be a problem when I was a public school teacher, and Mike's not telling anybody anything new. On top of that, it has nothing to do with whether Ritalin works, whether ADHD is a problem, or at which point behaviors affected by ADHD might or might not be considered sin. It's just about the rush to overprescribe, which happens with a lot of medicines. So why did he bring it up? Well, it might have just been him naturally meandering through various thoughts as he answered his question. I'm susceptible to doing the same thing when I'm live, which is why I think I do you a favor by scripting and reading my material. See? Look. But this story does affect Mike's audience, whether or not it was intended to. Jammed into this spot in the narrative, it functions to poison them against a clinical approach to ADHD before he moves on, to plant the thought in the back of their minds that it's lazy, half-assed, and generally subject to error, so that when he later starts talking about how it can't excuse what he claims is sin, His audience has this vague anecdotal justification for dismissing it, along with characterizing it as an inadequacy with how the world handles behavior, even though most of the world has been well aware of and contending with this problem for decades. This is where it's important to take stock of what point was actually made by an anecdote versus what feeling it gives you on a topic.
So the statements I'll now make about these things. 1 Corinthians 10:13 does give us a rule that I think applies to you, even if you have ADHD, even if you legitimately have it, even though I didn't exactly get a real diagnosis.
Okay, first off, if I'm trying to understand what expectations we should have of a person with ADHD, I'm not going to give much credence to what some guy thinks is implied by a passage from an ancient person's letter. Sorry, but we've made a lot of progress in understanding this topic since the 1st century CE, and there are several weak links in that chain of ideas anyway. Second, notice how he keeps saying, even if you legitimately have it, and referring to his questionable diagnosis. This starts to feel like a deliberate attempt to muddy the issue. If you're presented with someone you know has a legitimate condition like ADHD, it can get hard to maintain a clear-cut accusation in every situation that they're just sinning. But if you can maintain this vague sense that diagnoses are questionable, indeed that the problem is exaggerated to make an excuse for bad behavior, you can kind of subconsciously skirt your way around the dilemma while maintaining some pretense that it's just about choosing sin. But this only works if you let the issue remain fuzzy in your mind so you can ignore it. You know, like apologetics almost always does. The moment you instead bring it into focus, the problem just gets worse. And Mike's about to take a hard line here that makes it basically untenable.
The verse says, no temptation's overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. Do you believe that God is faithful? I do. He will not let you, this is based on God's faithfulness. He's not going to allow something. What's he not going to allow? He's not going to let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Now, some think the escape is, I'm escaping the temptation, but he means escaping the sin. So I'm going to be tempted. You will be tempted, but God is holding back temptation so that you do have a choice. So when it comes to ADHD, or and you mentioned specific issues, let's read them again. Sloth, bad work ethic, sin at work, praying for forgiveness. Okay, that's just something you were doing, but you were diagnosed with ADHD.
I want to let Mike keep digging this hole, but it's worth drawing attention to this core point, because it's really the linchpin of his horrifying message. He's saying that no matter what disability or condition you have, you should always be able to behave in certain specific ways. The logic is pretty clear. If God guarantees that you have it in your power to behave like X, then no condition should keep you from doing so. So if you say, I can't do X because I have ADHD, the retort is as simple as, well, yes, you can, because God said he'd always make it possible for you to do X. Therefore, if he allowed you to have ADHD, then it shouldn't be a barrier for doing X. So anytime you don't do X, you're making a willful and avoidable choice to sin. Now, while that logic is clear, it has one obvious problem. It's based on what some guy wrote in an ancient letter. That's why I don't automatically believe everything people write in ancient letters, especially if it leads me to shame people for things that might not be entirely under their control.
You now see that you can't help it without meds. Now, it's possible that meds help you and that things get easier with meds. But I'm going to tell you that this is, I think, the biblical truth. And this is the truth I tell myself too. It's hard, but I believe it's entirely true. Every time you were slothful at work, that you had bad work ethic, or that you sinned at work, that was a sin you didn't have to do. And that's based on God's faithfulness. 1 Corinthians 10:13. You didn't have to do it. Now, it might be true, and please hear me out, it might be true that with ADHD or whatever is going on with you, that you have increased temptations and you have increased difficulty handling the issues that are going on. But that fundamentally, the temptation is the same thing other people get tempted with, and there's countless people around the world that are tempted to be lazy, that are tempted to be distracted and stuff like that.
This seems to be the main thrust of Mike's answer to the question. And there are a few working pieces to it that we need to itemize in order to understand what he said and potentially where he went wrong. First is some form of undesirable behavior. This is obviously the starting point of the whole issue. Then there's the question of how much a person can control that behavior. This too is fairly obvious. But then there's a third thing that really informs where we go next and, ultimately, reveals the goal of this whole line of inquiry. And that is the question, why do we need to understand how much control a person has over their behavior? This can get complicated in any event, but if I were to speak for myself in broad terms, I'd say the point is to come up with ways to 1. Help the person most constructively interact within society, and 2. Help society involve that person and foster their potential. Ideally, this will help each person contribute to society while reaping its benefits. Now, this is a simple answer to what can become a very complex question that must be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But I just want to give the general flavor of what I consider a well-thought-out answer and point out one major thing about it. It's all about moving forward, about assessing a person's strengths and weaknesses to help them adopt more constructive behaviors as far as they can, or finding ways to accommodate them when they struggle to do so. Mike's apparent goal is much different. His goal is as simple as deciding, was this person at fault for their behavior to the point that you would consider it a sin? The problem is there's no constructive future goal of this assessment. It just helps you reach some finalized judgment of this person, or their behaviors, as good or bad. Not only is this not a helpful thing to do, but it forces you to make some overly simplified and often bizarre judgments of people that simply don't square with their situation. In this case, it leads to Mike boiling people's clinical conditions down to levels of temptation. Sure, you may have X condition and that might make you want to sin, but we all experience varying levels of temptation, and it's still on each of us to overcome that temptation. I mean, I might be more tempted toward distraction or sloth than my neighbor is, right? And I don't get off the hook for it. So why is someone with ADHD off the hook for distraction or sloth just because they're tempted even more? At the core of this is the practice of drawing a neat box around a certain set of behaviors and saying we're all obligated not to do them because they're sin. Once you've done this, you're almost certainly going to run into unrealistic expectations of people, and there's a danger you'll approach people needing support with a foundationally flawed end goal in mind, as well as unrealistic and often cruel expectations of them. Now, I take issue with immediately resorting to, I can't help it, and I'll get to what I mean by that later, but reducing a struggle someone has with a real clinical issue to, you're tempted but so am I so still just don't sin, is extraordinarily unhelpful, and if you ever say it to people you know, that might just be at the root of a lot of relational issues you have with them.
I used to have a guitar student who, he had ADHD. And at one point we're sitting there doing guitar lessons. He was losing interest in it, right? Which happens commonly with kids. You got like a teenager, he's like 14 or 15 or something. And I'm teaching him to play guitar and he's not really focusing. And so I stopped and I asked him, did you hear what I just asked you to do? And he's like, no, sorry, Mike. I said, no, I need you to focus. I need you to pay attention, that this is important, So do this behavior. And then he turned to me and he says, well, I can't help it. I have ADHD. This is my terror with ADHD diagnoses.
What Mike is alluding to here would be an actual problem. Flatly saying, I can't help it, I have ADHD, and not even trying is not a healthy response to your struggles. Now, I know there's some nuance here, and as a non-expert there's clearly a lot I don't know about this, so always seek qualified advice when needed. Sure, it could be understandable to throw your hands up in a moment of frustration and say, I just can't keep doing this, but I can see how casually using the mere existence of your condition to justify not trying, as Mike seems to represent his student doing, might encourage learned helplessness. It's not hard to imagine the negative consequence of the student doing this persistently. First, he would never get better at playing the guitar, and second, he would waste Mike's time and probably his parents' money. In short, to whatever extent he actually was using ADHD as an excuse to avoid a task he was actually capable of, he was undermining himself and failing his obligation to other people. This is why it's always helpful for a person to look for ways they can take control of a situation instead of reflexively considering themselves a victim of circumstance. However, there are a few questions worth asking at this point. First, is the situation as straightforward as Mike is describing it? The kid may have been using his diagnosis to dodge responsibility, but I'm not sure how thoroughly Mike had tried to understand the situation before reaching this conclusion. Second, how much should this one possible scenario color our entire view of ADHD and how to handle it? Mike saying, this is my terror with ADHD diagnosis, shows that the very possibility of people abusing it takes up way too much space in whatever part of his head considers anything about ADHD. And adding this to his previously expressed skepticism about how people diagnose it, It looks like he's at least hinting that it's largely a made-up problem used to excuse bad behavior. This is a really crude take on the topic, of course, but it's kind of necessary for a believer in Mike's position for reasons we'll explore here in a moment. The final question, one I'm not sure Mike gives enough thought to, is this. How might the responsible adult in this situation try to assist a youth who makes this remark? I've personally dealt with students who said things like this, though I wouldn't tell their stories in publicly released material with or without names, and there are a lot of things that would enter my mind upon hearing a student say something like that. Of course, a ton depends on a lot of nonverbal cues in the overall situation, but I'd want to get a sense of whether the student felt he really couldn't help it or was just making an excuse, or maybe if he fell somewhere in a gray area between the two he wasn't totally cognizant of. My concern would be less about establishing how at fault the student was, and more about how I could push him to get the best out of the experience and maybe grow to internalize some better strategies for dealing with moments of frustration or apathy. The point wouldn't be to coddle him, of course, so yes, there would be plenty of room to be firm and challenge him to push himself. But the point is, this isn't a simple issue. There's no easy answer for how much to push, how much to coax, how much to make allowances, and when to let up. So given that perspective, let's see how Mike handled the issue.
I can't help it. I have ADHD. I can now feel comfortable with my sin. I can now feel comfortable with my bad behaviors because I'm a special case. I have an excuse. I've got the get out of sin free card, get out of guilt free card, and I can throw it out there. I have ADHD. It's not my fault.
Now, first off, yuck. His summation of what the kid is thinking and why is pretty ugly. Basically, the question in his mind is how sinful or guilty the kid is, problematic in and of itself, and any excuse the kid is making is an attempt to avoid feeling guilty so he can continue choosing to sin. Not only are these remarks on their face, but think of how you're going to approach a kid if you think that's what's going on in his head. If you see the outcomes of his behavior as righteousness or wickedness, and his resistance to you as an attempt to choose wickedness, you've made the kid an enemy in your head and are approaching him with an adversarial posture instead of trying to work with him to achieve a better outcome.
So I told him, I said, I have a hard time paying attention to things too, but do you know what that means if you have ADHD? And he goes, what? I said, it means you have to work harder.
You probably do need to work harder at a lot of things if you have ADHD. But is that the one takeaway from learning you have it? Is it the one solution to improving your situation? That's what it seems like Mike's saying. No, he doesn't state it explicitly, but the fact that he goes straight to that one solution in his retelling of the story puts a lot of weight on it and seems to dismiss the need for other solutions. Now think of the ways I might have addressed the situation. Even the rough sketch I outlined is light years ahead of saying, just try harder, both in imagination and effectiveness. Now again, I would keep prompting a student to put in their best effort, but to blindly toss try harder in there with no curiosity about all the other factors that might make it hard for a student to focus, ADHD only being one of them, is just negligent. But here's the problem. If you view the world as a place in which people knowingly choose righteousness or sin, and God made sure everybody can choose righteousness if they want to, then what other advice is necessary? At any point in your life, no matter what else you might be going through, there is a righteous choice and you are fully capable of making it. And the only reason you don't make it is because through willfulness or laziness you would rather sin instead. If that's the case, what else is there to say but try harder? You don't need to provide the student any support. You don't need to have any insight into the student's home life, background, or disabilities. Any awareness of whether the student had anything to eat today, got much sleep last night, babysat his siblings all weekend, or lives with constant stress, abuse, or bullying. Regardless of all these factors, there's a right decision and a wrong decision, and God made it possible for him to make the right one. So if he didn't, he just isn't trying hard enough. So what's the point of you as an educator making sure the student has the tools to do the right thing? 1 Corinthians assures you the student already has those tools, so any failure is a choice on their part, and your role is just to confront them for choosing to give in to sin. Not great at all. But of course Mike's telling this story, so it comes to a neat, clean conclusion that vindicates his advice.
Well, the coolest thing was like a week later, we had a similar situation where he stopped paying attention for a moment. I said something, and he was just like staring at the wall. And then, which is, I understand. Okay, I'm not calling that sin.
I guess it's good that he doesn't call it sin. But this isn't a reinvention of his idea of behavior as much as a superficial concession that's so incongruous with his overall concept of right and wrong and judgment that it just opens up a bunch of questions. Why is staring at a wall when you're supposed to be engaging with a lesson not sin? I mean, isn't that sloth? He's apparently supposed to pay attention to Mike teaching him the guitar, and God gave him the ability to do this. So what leads him to accept the sinful choice not to engage? And if, for some reason, it's not sin, when does it become sin? I guess you could say that unintentionally drifting off isn't sin until someone draws our attention to it and you choose whether to listen, but isn't not paying attention still sloth? And if ADHD isn't an excuse for sloth, then why is absent-mindedness? The more you dig into these questions, the more it becomes clear that the very idea of finalizing a judgment of a behavior or person as sinful is pretty arbitrary. It comes mainly from a gut feeling about behavior, and the moment you try to clarify what's sin and what's not, you end up on a fuzzy line that, I'd argue, shows us that sin is an untenable concept at its core and just not a useful way of categorizing behavior.
I'm just using this as an example of how this diagnosis can cause you to just give up even trying to be godly. And he turned to me and he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I know. I really have to work harder. I got to try harder to pay attention."
And here's where, since it was Mike's story meant to illustrate Mike's point, his try harder advice fixed everything. Now who knows how true this story is? But even if it is, I wouldn't recommend this approach to any educators out there. But if you're any kind of qualified educator, you know better already.
That's the takeaway, right? If you're blind, you have to try harder to not run into things when you're walking. You can't just swing your stick around and run down the street and then tell people, "Sorry, I'm blind." You have to also work. Everybody understands you're blind, but you have to work harder to make sure that you don't run into things. This is the nature of being blind. When you're deaf, you have to work hard to read lips. You have to work hard to pay attention to what's going on around you. You can't just ignore the world and say, "Well, I'm deaf. It's no big deal." There's extra effort that needs to be put into it. I think that's the truth.
I'll admit these are some good examples of situations where people have to try harder. Sadly, circumstances have left a vision or hearing impaired person in a place where it takes more effort for them to do things the rest of us take for granted. A vision impaired person has to try harder to take lessons on reading Braille, traveling in public, and so on, and seemingly mundane activities will generally take more concentration for them. One of my best friends in high school was legally blind with degenerating eyesight in only one eye, so I have a limited secondhand appreciation for what this effort looks like. So what are the results if they do or don't do this? Well, if they do, they can have at least some of the opportunities we do to travel, socialize, engage in a variety of activities, and pursue careers. If they don't, life is going to be very difficult and possibly dreary. This is an easily understandable case of how natural consequences work, right? But Mike casts it all as a dichotomy between sin and not sin. This is really weird when you try to think it through to its logical conclusion, as we can see in his cartoonishly bizarre depiction of what vision or hearing impaired people not trying harder looks like. To him, it involves a blind person running down the street swinging a cane in all directions, with the consequence being that he's sinned against other people by running into them. It involves a deaf person just giving up because they don't want to try harder to read lips and pay attention, and just ignoring the world, which I guess Mike takes to be sin. Of course, the practical real-life consequences should be more than enough to deter such behavior, as the blind person is likely to get injured or killed and the deaf person is likely to suffer a dreary, isolated life. And in fact, these are the kinds of concerns that should be the driving force in discussing how to assist people with disabilities. But Mike constructs a story around and then fixates on ways these people have inconvenienced others by not trying harder, so he can characterize their behavior as nothing more than sin that they would happily get away with if nobody held them accountable. This is a weird, disgustingly insensitive view of the consequences of disability that can only arise from the need to pigeonhole all believers as an attempt to be good or evil. Honestly, I'm surprised this alone hasn't disqualified him as laughable to even most Christians.
Now, maybe your medication helps you. I'm not saying that it doesn't. I'm just saying, don't go there. I can't help it. All the sin I've done for all these years at work, where I was getting paid to do things I didn't do, where I was going behind my employer's back by misusing my time and basically stealing from them, that was totally not my fault. Don't go there. As a Christian, you need the grace of the cross. You don't need the excuses that tell you that you don't even need grace.
Notice what Mike did here. He summed up an issue of how a clinical condition might influence productivity and what we should do about it by talking about willfully going behind an employer's back and misusing time on the job. These are two totally different things. Sure, the question was presented to him in terms of sloth and bad work ethic, but the person asking it said they struggled with these issues and saw medication as a way to help themselves improve. So why is Mike's narrative about someone trying not to improve? It sounds nonsensical, but what else are you supposed to believe if you think behavior falls on the side of willful sin or willful righteousness? If you believe this, then lower productivity at work isn't a problem an employee can identify after the fact, introspect on, possibly seek help with, and try to mitigate going forward. It is and always was a choice, because high productivity is diligence and thus righteousness, while low productivity is sloth and thus sin. Basically, he draws a line between two concrete outcomes and says you're always responsible for landing on the right side of that line. And he means always responsible, no matter what your conditions or circumstances, because being on the wrong side is sin and God always gives you a way out of sin. But think of the questions that arise here. If a vision-impaired person isn't as productive at work as other employees, is that a sin? Is the solution just to try harder? Or are there accommodations that can be made for this employee and perhaps tasks that can be selected or modified for them? Would there not be a common sense expectation that they might be less productive in certain ways? Or take me, for example. I've had back problems that could decrease my productivity at work. Might it feel or look like sloth if I moved slower and was perhaps less productive? Sure, but I still do my best, and I've sought clinical assistance such as exercise regimens and occasional medication that almost always have me at full speed. The same goes for someone with ADHD. The struggles they have might look and feel like sloth, but those struggles are real and they warrant a lot more than a prompting to try harder. So if medication helps them function better, why minimize that or just shame them for the supposed laziness they supposedly indulged in before finding a solution? Why not praise them for noticing the problem and looking for a solution? Telling them to try harder is as useless as telling me to try harder when I couldn't get off the floor because my back was seized up. And minimizing the necessity of medication is equally stupid and dick-headed in either situation. The further you think it through to its logical conclusion, the more Mike's take on this is revealed to be dangerous and just vile. I mean, if certain behaviors are just flatly sin and God gave us all the ability to avoid them, what are you going to think if you see a severely autistic person screaming and throwing things in response to sensory issues being triggered? Is that behavior sin? Shouldn't they just try harder not to do it? If you read the Bible to a person with severe developmental delays and the teaching does not appear to have any effect, are they sinning by not acting on what they'd heard? After all, God's word is perfect and never returns void, and we all have a chance to respond to it. Don't they just need to try harder to accept the word of the Lord? We're all tempted to lose control of ourselves or not pay attention to God's word, but God gave us the means to resist these temptations. So did He not give the means to people with disabilities? Don't they just have to try harder, just like we have to try harder than some other people? Of course, you could try to make exceptions for these cases, but any exception will be pulling on a thread that causes the entire idea of sin to come unraveled and suggests exceptions in cases Mike tries to take a hard line on. These are the kinds of problems you face when you overlook the reality of how clinical issues can impact a person and dismiss the variety of real, necessary measures that can help achieve better outcomes. And getting more deeply to the root of the issue, it's what happens when your ultimate goal is not to reach these outcomes moving forward, but to judge whether a person is choosing to do something as arbitrary as what you consider sin and insist they just need to stop it. This is where the crude binary division of behaviors as sin and righteousness just totally fails us on a conceptual level. And any time it's applied in real life, especially with the expectation that anybody, no matter what their condition or circumstances, can choose the right one, it becomes disastrous and cruel. So I'd suggest that if Mike Winger has a theological answer and not a medical answer, then he has no answer. And the world would be a better place, especially for the most vulnerable among us, if people like him stop sharing their barbaric, unhelpful non-answers. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.